Okay, so I'm finally getting back to finishing up recording the Gilded Age. So I wanted to kind of revisit because I don't remember exactly where I left off. So you've got three big concepts, and these three concepts that are on this page are absolutely the concepts that you must know for the STAR test. The first one is the concept of individualism. This should be fairly familiar to you in the sense that it kind of relates back to Alexis de Tocqueville, the idea of opportunity, being able to make the most out of your life, equality, all that kind of stuff. So individualism is a big piece of kind of the Gilded Age, the idea that you can make it. If you read The Jungle and you kind of look at the story of how how Jurgis comes over from Lithuania. That's very much kind of this individualistic kind of story. This is what he's hoping for, right? If I work harder and, work harder, then I'll be successful. And that, the inclination is that you don't depend on the government, you don't depend on handouts, that anyone can be successful. Now, of course, the big prevailing question, and having, if you guys are reading, or not if you are reading, but assuming that you're doing your reading for The Jungle, that obviously individualism in the Gilded Age is not 100% certain, right? In fact, it's probably not even 70% certain. It's probably not even 40% certain for some people. So understand that individualism is problematic because one never knows exactly how things are going to shape out. And so when you talk about the next concepts, social Darwinism, which is this idea that takes Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest and applies it to society, that there are certain individuals that are just a little bit better, a little bit smarter, that to those people that are kind of have things go well for them, they're just a little bit, they're just superior. And so that's why they succeed. And it really kind of absolves society, if you will, of having to be responsible for people that struggle or don't make it, that kind of thing. Really kind of underpins this idea of the free enterprise system, the free market, competition's good. The winners of competition are the ones that should succeed. The losers are the ones that shouldn't succeed. You could think of this very kind of Donald Trumpian, that sort of thing. Rockefeller was one of the robber barons that really kind of bought into social Darwinism. Of course, Rockefeller with his Standard Oil and his horizontal integration, where he destroyed his competitors, and he felt like, hey, if you can't compete with me and I can buy you out, then, too bad for you. Your other concept is going to be the gospel of wealth. This is a little bit of a variation. Now, understand that Andrew Carnegie is a robber baron. He is somebody that runs, a successful business, makes lots of money, has this vertical integration. I mean, his business, his industry is lean and mean, and he's hard to compete with because he's that good at what he does. But part of what he's struggling with is this idea that he recognizes that for some people, the deck is stacked against him. And you could probably attribute this to his immigrant experience, that he understands that sometimes it's hard to get a leg up, right? And so his attitude is not that the government should give handouts, but rather that the wealthy individuals of American society should give back to society. That rather than taking advantage of the capitalistic system and the money that they can make, what they should do is donate to libraries, music halls, art museums, to let ordinary people have exposure to kind of the finer things in life so that they could have aspirations to kind of work harder and do better. The idea is that you need to be motivated, right? And so gospel of wealth is this philanthropic notion. This, philanthropy is the idea of helping other people, helping society, the love of your mankind, right? And that's kind of what he's talking about. And again, this is meant to kind of undergird the notion of individualism, not necessarily in giving handouts to people, but in giving them motivation, exposing them to knowledge and information and things that would help people make good decisions. Okay, so those are kind of the big concepts that you need to know. And I can guarantee that social Darwinism and or gospel of wealth will be on the STAR test in one form or fashion. Now, here's the problem. So if we accept that those are the concepts of the Gilded Age, and we know that industrialization has created lots of factories, lots of low-wage jobs, right? That technology is starting to automate the system, that you're having lots of people moving into the cities to work at the factories, that what's going to happen is you have crowded cities, crowded living conditions. You have, people, because you have so many immigrants, so many people vying for these jobs, wages tend to be low. We don't have any government regulation, so the jobs are dangerous. There's a lot of toxicity, long hours, that kind of thing. And because you have increasing efficiency, thanks to technology and efficiency studies and those kinds of things, you're going to have more and more production, which means prices are going to drop, which means the profit share for a company is going to get smaller. And as that profit share gets smaller, they have to do something. They have to cut wages. So they start dropping prices. And they start dropping the wages that they pay the workers. And this is going to ultimately mean that the workers can't even afford to take advantage of the low prices of the products, of the things that they're making. And so for a lot of workers, they're going to feel very much left out. Because, the businesses can form these monopolies, these trusts, these holding companies in order to manipulate the industry. And remember that one of the problems with a monopoly or a trust is that you essentially have the same ownership of multiple companies. And so if you don't like working for company A and you think, oh, I'll go over to company B and get a job, and it's owned by the same person, they might not want to hire you, or they might pay the exact same wage. So it limits not only the choice for the consumer, because the consumer fundamentally is not getting the best product for the best price, because a monopoly is going to allow for one business to dominate a particular industry, but the workers are not going to have very much in the form of choice. And so you're going to see that a lot of workers will ultimately begin to form unions. And the intent of this is to strike a balance against the businesses and against the owners. And remember that these robber barons often have very close connections with Congress, with politicians, that politicians own stock in their companies. And these kind of things are going to make workers feel very much left out. And so this is kind of where the motivation for unionization comes from. And again, understand that part of the success of unions, as opposed to, say, the Lowell factory girls, when they first started to unionize, if you look at the graphs there in the lower right, you can see that by the time you get to 1900, the United States has become increasingly industrialized and increasingly urban. And a lot of these unions will do a variety of things to try to force the ownership to negotiate. Sometimes they'll strike and they'll just basically refuse to work, or they'll walk off the job. Sometimes they'll slow down production and make things very inefficient. But that was a dangerous game to play because you had so much immigration. There was always a steady supply of workers to take your place. And so if you participated with the union, you ran the risk of losing your job. And, whether that was because, oh, hey, I went on strike and now they don't want to hire me back, or whether it's because they can blacklist you and that kind of thing and make it so it's very difficult, to get hired anywhere. And this, of course, is made worse by the monopolies and the trusts and that sort of thing. So again, understand that you have opposition to the workers and the unions. Part of this is going to be this notion of immigration, more workers driving down wages, creating competition among workers, kind of thwarting the efforts of the unions. And that aspect is going to lead to what we call nativism. And I think I've touched on nativism before, back in the fall when we were talking about the Irish. You certainly see that happening in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where there was a lot of resistance to foreign-born people, people from Greece, people from Russia, people from Eastern Europe, that kind of thing. Also people from China, people from Asia, from the Middle East, you name it. So businesses will see the unions as a violation of free enterprise. And in fact, they will make the argument that unions are, in fact, a monopoly, right? Which is not exactly the intent of the term monopoly. But what they'll say is that they're restricting competition because unions want to force employers to pay a set wage, okay? That it interferes with my right as a business owner. You know, I own a business. I have the right to do what I want with my business. And so the idea of a blacklist, which is a list of people that participate with unions and they share it across an industry so they don't get hired, whether it's locking out the union workers, refusing to pay them, bringing in strike breakers. And that's where kind of those immigrant workers come in, African Americans. So you have some racial components to some of these unionization issues. And again, there's no laws protecting the unions. The unions exist kind of after the fact. And so most court systems and the government will actually go in favor of the businesses. In fact, you'll see a lot of times the federal government will actually use troops. This happens on several different occasions. Things like the railroad strike. The railroad strikes were notorious for having federal intervention. You saw that the Carnegie, one of the Homestead strike, they used private detectives to break the strike. And again, of course, this is the problem with this is that a lot of these people, whether they're congressmen, whether it's a city government, whatever, a lot of these politicians have a business relationship with the company. So there's maybe kind of an incentive for them to help the business break the strike. Not in every case, but in some of the cases. And the court system, of course, will often force the workers to go back to work. The court system is not very favorable in the 1800s. In the late 1800s, you have an extremely conservative court that believes in free market and sides with the rich and sides with businesses, sides with whites. And violence will often be a big result of kind of these tensions between business owners and unions. Now, there's a few key events that I want to point out, and I'll kind of show you here in a second another one, another list of events, or at least kind of point it out to you. But these are the ones that you must know for the STAR test, okay? These are the ones that I've seen pop up in some form or fashion. The first one is the railroad strike of 1877. This one is the result of a stock bubble. Remember, we have railroad expansion. You'd had the election of 1876, all this kind of stuff. And I actually think that's supposed to be 1873. I think that year's wrong. Regardless, it's in the 1870s. So the railroad strike in the 1870s, stock bubble, it bursts. You have this 80,000 workers walk out. They tear up the railroad tracks. It is 1877 because it's President Hayes. President Hayes sends in troops. It's Credit Mobilier. That's 1873. Sorry, getting my railroad scandals mixed up. President Hayes sends in troops, and you end up with like 100 dead. This is going to cause the creation of the Knights of Labor. And you might want to stick in the back of your head kind of the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor are an early union group. They're open to all workers, not just skilled labor. They welcome skilled, unskilled, black, white, men, women, you name it. Okay. Very, very broad membership. Matter of fact, they end up by 1885 having 700,000 members. Now, they use strikes, they use boycotts, they advocate for aggressive arbitration. Some of the interesting concepts here is they want equal pay for women. They want 8-hour workdays. If you have an 8-hour workday, then you have to basically hire 2 people to work the same shift that you're now paying 1 person. You pay women the same. What that means is that companies are not going to have an incentive to hire women to do work because they can't pay them cheaper. They want to keep track of statistics, so they advocate for a Bureau of Labor to kind of keep track of, where people are working, just to kind of have the data. Because understand that by 1885, you don't really have anybody keeping this kind of, labor data. There was some conversation about ending child labor, those kinds of things, for the same reason they wanted to end, create equal pay for women, right? We don't want to make it so that companies can hire women and children for cheap when they should be paying men. Okay. The Knights of Labor is going to organize in 1886, basically kind of a day-long celebration. They have a bunch of speakers, they have a parade, all this kind of stuff. And so they're listening in Chicago at this Haymarket Square to some speakers. And all of a sudden, you have the police kind of hanging around, keeping an eye on things. And all of a sudden you have an explosion. Some homemade kind of explosive devices being tossed into the crowd of police officers, and it kills several of the police, creates chaos, all this kind of stuff. And they never exactly find out. They realize that there's probably some anarchists, that kind of thing. And they arrest a bunch of these anarchist people and send them off to jail. And this is going to destroy the Knights of Labor, even though there is no clear connection between the Knights of Labor and the Haymarket Riot in 1886. Just the simple fact that it happened at the same time. And understand that a lot of this has to do with the bad press, with, kind of this idea of chaos, the fact that the unions had been labeled by a lot of the business owners as being kind of anarchist, that kind of thing, whether or not that was true. So the Knights of Labor will their membership will shrink. This will also be compounded by another kind of economic contraction. So suddenly people are desperate for jobs, so they don't have the luxury of unionization. And so about the same time, you're going to have the American Federation of Labor get created. And the AFL is different from the Knights of Labor. First off, they're focused on skilled labor only trade skills, specialized businesses, specialized fields, specialized industries. So what that does is it limits membership. They also limit membership to men only. So women have to go create their own union. They do have a black AFL and a white AFL, but they kind of separate those. And they focus on not going on strike, not going on boycotts, but rather we just want negotiation. Right, let's sit down at the table. These are the concerns that the workers have. Let's all just get along. Let's just have a conversation. We just want to recognize the rights of unions to, present a list of demands, that kind of thing. They don't really go into specific detail about an 8-hour workday and all that kind of stuff. So very kind of much easier, much gentler kind of demands from the AFL. And so the AFL will actually be the organization that will kind of last. In fact, we have kind of iterations of the AFL still around today. AFL-CIO is one of them. You have like the American Federation of Teachers that I belong to as an AFL affiliated union organization, that kind of thing. So you've got the AFL kind of replacing the Knights of Labor. Now, the last one I'm going to mention is the Pullman strike of 1894. George Pullman was not a really nice guy, really took advantage of his workers, actually cuts their pay because his profit margin is suffering. Not that he wasn't already a filthy rich guy, because he was, just decided that, hey, it's my company and I don't have to take a pay cut, so my workers will. He also had these company stores and company towns where he would pay his workers with company money. So it wasn't like American dollars, it was company dollars, and they could exchange it for American money, but they had to pay a fee to do that. So basically, it's like a business offering a check cashing service, except they get to keep 3% of your check. Right. So he was getting that kind of stuff. He was charging in these company stores high prices for the food and that kind of thing. And so Eugene V. Debs, and you'll want to remember Eugene Debs' name because we'll be talking about him periodically as we move through kind of this phase of the Gilded Age into World War I. Eugene V. Debs is the head of the American Railway Union. He orchestrates a strike where basically the railroad workers refuse to touch a Pullman car. Now, George Pullman, not to be outdone, attaches the mail cars to the Pullman cars. So by not touching a Pullman car, they're interfering with the U.S. mail. So this is going to mean President Grover Cleveland has to send in troops. Federal courts order them to go back to work. So the Pullman strike is kind of notable because of George Pullman, because of Eugene V. Debs. But like many other strikes, it doesn't really play out the way they were hoping. And we saw the same thing happening with the railroad strike. So understand that you've got kind of this development, Knights of Labor, American Federation of Labor. You want to affiliate Knights of Labor with unskilled work, more radical agenda, American Federation of Labor with skilled work, very conservative agenda. But understand that many of your workers are going to be very skeptical of unions. They've seen too many blacklists. They've seen too many people lose their jobs. Economic demands mean that people need jobs. And the economic kind of boom and bust cycle that begins to happen more rapidly means that people don't have the luxury to really develop a union. So just kind of know that this is what, when we're talking about unionization, you're talking about this essential effort of companies, of workers trying to find something to stand up to the companies, that the companies are kind of creating this monolithic power and they feel like they need to stand up to them. And they try this in numerous different ways. Most of it doesn't succeed. It's going to probably be it's going to be until the 1930s before you really start to see successful unionization. Although the women's union, the Women's Trade Workers Union will be somewhat successful. Of course, you can thank a lot of the suffrage advocates for that, and this is going to get tangled up with women's suffrage as well. And so this kind of takes us to this idea about women, children, and blacks. So women were increasingly making up the workforce because they were able to be paid less. They still predominantly worked in female jobs, clothing, food, that kind of thing. They're going to advocate for that 8-hour day so that they hire more people. They want a minimum wage, right, to guarantee a living wage for people. And they want to end child labor because they don't want the job competition. And the idea that children should be in school. So the Women's Trade Union League is going to end up being fairly powerful. And this is going to happen because with the demise of the Knights of Labor, they have to create their own union. And since they tended to work in industries unique to themselves, it was very difficult to get the American Federation of Labor to represent them. Children often work because of the low wages. It typically took everybody working. And of course, The Jungle does a pretty good job of depicting that. African Americans, often the last hired, first fired, often used as strike breakers. So just kind of understand that you have trade unions like the AFL that are skilled. Because they're skilled, they have more leverage. The Knights of Labor were more kind of generalized. All unions, all unions, women, Knights of Labor, AFL, all of them to some extent want better, safer working conditions, better, stable wages, 8-hour workday, an end to child labor. They try to apply political pressure, but oftentimes the union activity is very situation specific, with the exception of Eugene V. Debs, who will eventually run for president, kind of on a union platform. With the exception of him, most union activity, most strikes, most actions are very specific to something, right? So one of the things that you don't want to forget is that farmers are struggling. So we'll be talking when we get to the politics of this. We'll see how farmers begin to create their own organization as well. We know that businesses have monopolies and trusts and holding companies, and they have this close relationship with politicians. We see that workers are forming a union. And now we're going to see that farmers are going to start to form their own group because they're struggling as well with some of the same things, right? Overproduction, driving prices down, having a high debt load. So some of these same things. So you're going to have a large group of the country that's really struggling with the industrial workers, with the urban dwellers, with the farmers. So this is part of why this period is known as gilded, because the wealth and prosperity is really only limited to a small group of people. But this wealth that's being generated demands the cheap labor, right? The cheap labor keeps the profit margins, very large for the companies, as well as providing a steady stream of consumers. And this need for consumers, we have to have people to buy our stuff, right? Remember, we have high tariffs, so we don't have all that many foreign markets for our things. And government's basically going to back up whatever business wants to do. So I think it's kind of important for you to kind of grasp these key things. Now, the piece that I wanted to point out to you is this PDF that's on labor versus management. And I'll just kind of show it to you very briefly because it kind of ties in with the union activity. That is, if it'll ever pull up. But it really just kind of runs through a few of the key events, touches some on the ones that I've already told you about, like the Haymarket riot, the Pullman strike, that kind of thing. So it will kind of revisit some of those issues. But it also goes through these ideas of yellow dog contracts, the use of private guards, court injunctions, gives you a little bit of an idea about how that all kind of works out. So I suggest you maybe kind of look over that. The Homestead strike is another interesting one because it's related to Andrew Carnegie, and kind of how, with him cutting wages. So being familiar with organized labor and kind of its broad concept, and this kind of handout kind of does that, as well as the PowerPoint. The state of Texas doesn't ask you a ton of questions about labor unions, but they will ask you questions about free enterprise, about the businesses and free market. And sometimes they'll ask you a question about how unions try to interfere with that. What are unions wanting? What do they want to accomplish in the system? And why do they want to accomplish it? And how do companies try to keep unions from accomplishing that? So those are some of kind of the big ideas, if you will. So I'm going to end this here before we pick up and we go on to the next one, which is going to be politics in the Gilded Age.